The Dark Strangler, the Earle Nelson story. In the Roaring Twenties, as America danced to jazz and celebrated newfound prosperity, a shadow moved across the continent. Between 1926 and 1927, panic gripped communities from San Francisco to Winnipeg as a mysterious killer targeted the most trusting members of society, landladies who opened their doors to strangers seeking room and board. This is the story of Earle Leonard Nelson, known to history as the Gorilla Man and the Dark Strangler, a drifter whose violent rampage across North America would claim at least 22 lives and forever change how Americans viewed the safety of their own homes. The 1920s in America was an era of dramatic transformation. The nation was experiencing unprecedented economic growth, urban expansion, and social change. Cities were growing rapidly, and with this growth came a transient population of workers, drifters, and those seeking new opportunities. Boarding houses and rooms for rent were common fixtures in every city, providing temporary homes for this mobile population. It was within this context of movement and anonymity that Earle Nelson would exploit the basic human kindness of those who opened their homes to strangers. In an era before computerized records, interstate communication systems, or coordinated law enforcement databases, a killer could move from city to city, state to state, leaving death in his wake while remaining virtually invisible to authorities. Earle Leonard Nelson was born on May 12, 1897 in San Francisco, California. His early life was marked by tragedy and instability that would profoundly shape his future. When Earle was just 10 months old, his mother, Frances Farrall, died of syphilis, a disease that may have been transmitted to her infant son. His father died shortly after, leaving the toddler orphaned before his second birthday. The orphaned child was taken in by his maternal grandmother, Jenny Nelson, whose surname he would later adopt. Life with his grandmother in San Francisco provided some stability, but signs of trouble emerged early. Those who knew young Earle described him as a quiet, withdrawn child who struggled to form normal social connections with his peers. A pivotal moment in Nelson's childhood occurred when he was 10 years old. While riding his bicycle, he collided with a streetcar and suffered a severe head injury that left him unconscious for 6 days. After recovering, family members and acquaintances noted dramatic changes in his personality. The once merely withdrawn boy became increasingly erratic, prone to violent outbursts, and began experiencing what he described as religious visions. The head injury's impact on Nelson's developing brain cannot be understated. Modern understanding of traumatic brain injuries, particularly in children, reveals how such trauma can affect impulse control, emotional regulation, and cognitive function. Combined with his possible congenital syphilis and early childhood trauma, Nelson's neurological damage created a dangerous psychological foundation. As Nelson entered adolescence, his behavior became increasingly disturbing. He developed an obsession with the Bible, often quoting scripture at inappropriate times and claiming to receive direct messages from God. Yet this religious fervor existed alongside increasingly violent and sexual impulses that he struggled to control. At age 14, Nelson was expelled from school after multiple incidents of aggressive behavior toward classmates and teachers. His grandmother, unable to manage his escalating violence, had him committed to the Napa State Mental Hospital in 1913 when he was 16 years old. Hospital records describe a young man experiencing hallucinations, violent episodes, and an inability to distinguish reality from his religious delusions. Nelson escaped from Napa State Hospital multiple times over the next several years, each time being recaptured and returned. During one of these escapes in 1919, at age 21, he met Mary Martin, a 58-year-old woman who ran a small store. Despite the significant age difference and Nelson's obvious mental instability, they married on August 12, 1919. The marriage was troubled from the start, with Mary later describing Nelson as violent, sexually deviant, and prone to disappearing for days at a time. After his marriage collapsed and following another escape from mental custody, Nelson began the nomadic lifestyle that would characterize his criminal career. He moved constantly, taking odd jobs, staying in boarding houses, and presenting himself as a mild-mannered, Bible-reading traveler seeking temporary lodging. The first confirmed murder attributed to Earle Nelson occurred on February 20th, 1926, in San Francisco. Clara Newman, a 60-year-old landlady, was found strangled in her home after showing a room to a prospective tenant. The killer had not only strangled his victim, but had also engaged in necrophilic acts, a disturbing pattern that would become his signature. Just 2 weeks later, on March 2nd, 1926, Laura Beale, another San Francisco landlady, was found dead under similar circumstances. The proximity of the murders and their identical nature suggested a single perpetrator, but police had few leads. The killer left little physical evidence, and witnesses could only provide vague descriptions of a dark-haired man of medium build who carried a Bible. Nelson's method was consistently calculated. He would respond to room-for-rent advertisements, presenting himself as a religious, soft-spoken man in need of lodging. Once alone with his victim, almost always older women who lived alone, he would strangle them with his bare hands, displaying enormous physical strength that earned him the moniker the Gorilla Man in newspaper accounts. After the San Francisco murders, Nelson began a terrifying journey across America that would span 15 months and cover thousands of miles. On June 10, 1926, Lillian St. Mary was murdered in her San Francisco home. 2 weeks later, on June 24th, George Russell was killed in Santa Barbara, one of Nelson's few male victims, likely killed because he witnessed Nelson attempting to assault his wife. Nelson's mobility made him nearly impossible to track. He traveled by freight train, hitchhiking, and walking, often covering vast distances in short periods. On August 16, 1926, he struck in Seattle, killing Mary Nisbet. By October, he had moved to Portland, Oregon, where he murdered Beata Withers on October 19th, Virginia Grant on October 24th, and Mabel Fluke on November 15th. The pattern was always similar, yet police departments in different cities failed to connect the crimes initially. Communication between jurisdictions was limited, and the concept of a traveling serial killer was still relatively unknown to law enforcement. Each city's police force investigated their murders in isolation, unaware that they were dealing with the same perpetrator. As 1926 drew to a close, Nelson continued his rampage. On November 18th, he killed Blanche Myers in Oregon City. Moving south to California, he murdered Mrs. George Austin in San Francisco on November 24th. 2 days later, on November 26th, Mrs. William Edmonds was found dead in San Francisco, followed by Florence Monks on December 23rd in Seattle. By early 1927, newspapers had begun to connect the murders, dubbing the unknown killer the Dark Strangler and the Gorilla Man. Panic spread through communities across the West Coast. Landladies refused to rent to strangers, and police departments finally began sharing information about the mysterious killer who seemed to vanish like smoke after each murder. The investigation was hampered by the limitations of 1920s forensic science. Fingerprinting was still in its infancy, DNA analysis was decades away, and even basic communication between police departments required telegrams or letters. The killer's constantly changing location and appearance, he often altered his clothing and facial hair, made identification nearly impossible. Witnesses who had seen the man provided varying descriptions, though common elements emerged. A man in his late 20s or early 30s, approximately 5 or 6 tall, weighing around 160 pounds, with dark hair and unusually strong hands. He often carried a Bible and spoke softly, presenting himself as deeply religious. 1927 saw Nelson expand his killing grounds dramatically. On February 3rd, he murdered Mrs. H.C. Murray in Council Bluffs, Iowa, his first confirmed killing outside the West Coast. The geographic expansion made the investigation even more complex, as now multiple states' law enforcement agencies were involved, each with their own procedures and jurisdictions. Nelson's pace accelerated alarmingly. On April 27, 1927, he killed Mary McConnell in Philadelphia. On May 1st, Jenny Randolph was murdered in Buffalo, New York. The killer was now striking every few days, moving vast distances between murders. On May 27th, he killed Fannie Mae in Detroit, and on May 30th, Maureen Oswald was found dead in Chicago. The speed and geographic spread of the murders created widespread panic. Newspapers across the country carried daily updates about the Strangler, and boarding house owners began refusing male tenants entirely. Some cities posted police guards at rooming houses, while vigilante groups formed to patrol neighborhoods. In June 1927, Nelson crossed into Canada, where his final victims awaited. On June 8th, he murdered 14-year-old Lola Cowan in Winnipeg, Manitoba, his youngest known victim. The murder of a child sparked unprecedented public outrage and intensified the manhunt. On June 9th, just one day later, he killed Emily Patterson, also in Winnipeg. The Winnipeg murders proved to be Nelson's undoing. The close proximity of the two murders and the public outcry over Lola Cowan's death led to a massive manhunt. Every available police officer in Winnipeg was mobilized, and the provincial government offered a substantial reward for information leading to the killer's capture. On June 15, 1927, Nelson was spotted in Killarney, Manitoba, about 150 miles southwest of Winnipeg. A store clerk noticed a man matching the killer's description and alerted authorities. When confronted by Constable William Gray, Nelson initially gave a false name but was unable to provide satisfactory identification. A search revealed items belonging to Emily Patterson, and Nelson was arrested. News of the capture spread rapidly across North America. Crowds gathered at every station as Nelson was transported back to Winnipeg, with some attempting to lynch him. The authorities had to use decoy trains and heavy police guards to ensure he reached Winnipeg alive for trial. Nelson's trial began on November 1, 1927, in Winnipeg. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and family members of victims. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including items belonging to victims found in Nelson's possession and numerous witness identifications. The defense attempted to argue insanity, presenting evidence of Nelson's head injury, his multiple hospitalizations, and his obvious mental disturbances. Several psychiatrists testified about Nelson's condition, describing him as suffering from dementia praecox, what would today be diagnosed as schizophrenia, combined with brain damage from his childhood injury. Nelson himself proved to be a difficult defendant. He frequently disrupted proceedings with religious outbursts, claimed to be receiving messages from God, and insisted on his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. At one point, he attempted to strangle his own defense attorney in the courtroom, requiring multiple guards to restrain him. The jury deliberated for just 40 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. On November 2, 1927, Nelson was sentenced to death by hanging. The judge, in passing sentence, noted the particularly heinous nature of the crimes and expressed regret that Canadian law did not allow for multiple death sentences. Public reaction to the verdict was overwhelmingly supportive. Newspapers across North America celebrated the conviction, with many editorializing about the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies and improved tracking of mental patients who escaped custody. Nelson's attorneys immediately filed appeals, arguing that their client's obvious mental illness should have precluded a death sentence. They presented additional evidence of Nelson's psychiatric history and argued that the trial had been prejudiced by intense public emotion and media coverage. The appeals process moved quickly through the Canadian courts. The Manitoba Court of Appeal upheld the conviction and sentence on December 8, 1927. A final appeal to the federal level was denied on January 10, 1928. Throughout the appeals, Nelson remained in custody at the provincial jail in Winnipeg, where guards reported he spent his time reading the Bible and claiming innocence. As his execution date approached, Nelson's behavior became increasingly erratic. He refused to eat, claimed to be Jesus Christ, and told guards that God would intervene to prevent his execution. Prison officials had to force-feed him to keep him alive for his scheduled execution. On January 13, 1928, at 7:30 a.m., Earle Leonard Nelson was hanged at the Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg. His final words were a rambling religious statement proclaiming his innocence and forgiveness for his executioners. He was 30 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. While Nelson's story has been preserved in criminal history, it's crucial to remember his victims, at least 22 confirmed, though authorities suspected the actual number was higher. These were not just statistics, but real people with families, dreams, and lives cut tragically short. Most of Nelson's victims were older women who ran boarding houses or rented rooms to supplement their income. They were widows and working women trying to make ends meet in an era with few economic opportunities for women. Clara Newman, his first known victim, was supporting 3 grandchildren. Laura Beale was saving money to visit her daughter in Ohio. Each victim had a story, a life that mattered. The murder of 14-year-old Lola Cowan particularly shocked the public. She had been selling flowers to help support her family when Nelson encountered her. Her death marked a departure from his usual pattern and demonstrated the escalation of his violence. Her family never fully recovered from the loss, with her mother suffering a nervous breakdown that required long-term hospitalization. The families of Nelson's victims formed some of the first victim advocacy groups in North American criminal justice history. They pushed for better communication between police departments, improved tracking of mental patients, and stronger security measures for boarding house operators. The Earle Nelson case exposed critical weaknesses in North American law enforcement that led to significant reforms. The inability of police departments to share information across jurisdictions had allowed Nelson to kill with impunity for over a year. In response, several states and provinces established primitive information sharing networks that would eventually evolve into modern criminal databases. The case also highlighted the dangers posed by individuals with severe mental illness who were not properly monitored or treated. Nelson had escaped from mental institutions multiple times without any systematic effort to track or recapture him. Following his execution, many jurisdictions implemented stricter protocols for managing potentially dangerous psychiatric patients. For the boarding house industry, the Nelson murders marked a turning point. Many establishments began requiring references, implemented stronger locks and security measures, and some hired security guards. The casual, trusting nature of the room rental business was forever changed. The term serial killer wouldn't be coined for another half-century, but Earle Nelson represented one of the first recognized examples of this type of criminal in North America. His case would be studied by future generations of criminologists and behavioral scientists seeking to understand the psychology of repetitive murder. Modern psychological analysis of Earle Nelson reveals a complex interplay of factors that created a perfect storm of violence. The childhood head injury, possible congenital syphilis, early parental loss, and subsequent mental illness all contributed to his pathology. Today, such an individual would likely receive intensive psychiatric treatment and monitoring. Nelson exhibited many characteristics now recognized as common among serial killers: childhood trauma, head injury, animal cruelty in youth, sexual dysfunction, and an inability to form normal human relationships. His religious obsessions provided a framework for his delusions, but also served as a mask that allowed him to appear harmless to his victims. The necrophilic aspect of Nelson's crimes was particularly disturbing to 1920s society, which had little understanding of such paraphilias. Modern forensic psychiatrists would likely diagnose Nelson with multiple conditions including schizophrenia, antisocial personality disorder, and various paraphilias, all complicated by organic brain damage. The Earle Nelson case entered American criminal folklore, inspiring numerous books, films, and television episodes over the decades. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking behind seemingly harmless facades and the vulnerability of society's most trusting members. Crime writers of the era used Nelson's case to explore themes of mental illness, religious mania, and the dark underbelly of American mobility. His ability to move freely across the continent, exploiting the very openness and trust that characterized American society, struck at fundamental anxieties about modern life. The case also influenced popular culture's portrayal of serial killers. The image of the soft-spoken, Bible-carrying killer who could transform into a violent monster became a recurring trope in crime fiction. Nelson's combination of religious mania and sexual violence particularly fascinated writers and filmmakers. The story of Earle Leonard Nelson serves as a dark chapter in North American criminal history, but also as a catalyst for positive change in law enforcement, mental health treatment, and victim advocacy. His rampage exposed vulnerabilities in society's safety nets that, once recognized, could be addressed and strengthened. Today, the coordination between law enforcement agencies that might have stopped Nelson sooner is taken for granted. Mental health treatment, while still imperfect, has advanced dramatically from the crude methods of the 1920s. The victims' rights movement, partly born from tragedies like the Nelson murders, ensures that those who suffer from crime are not forgotten in the pursuit of justice. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Earle Nelson case is the recognition that predators often hide behind masks of normalcy, exploiting the very qualities that make society function: trust, kindness, and the willingness to help strangers in need. While we cannot live in constant fear, awareness and reasonable precaution can prevent tragedy. Earle Leonard Nelson was executed on January 13, 1928, ending one of the continent's first recognized serial killing sprees. 22 confirmed victims died at his hands, with possibly more never identified or connected to his crimes. This account is dedicated to their memory and to the recognition that behind every criminal case are real people whose lives were forever altered by violence. The investigation into Earle Nelson's crimes revealed the importance of interagency cooperation, proper mental health monitoring, and the need to take seriously the safety concerns of society's most vulnerable members. While we remember this dark chapter, we must also acknowledge the positive changes that emerged from tragedy, changes that continue to protect potential victims today.